Story 1. The perimeter. Elias Vance hadn't come to the A-frame cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains for peace. He'd come for silence. Silence, he'd hoped, was the only antidote to the constant, buzzing static of the city and the deeper, corrosive hum of his own relentless insomnia. He was a journalist, or had been, until the cycle of tragedy reporting and the endless deadlines had burned his synapses down to useless ash. Now, he was just Elias, a man renting a remote, two-story wooden box 5 miles past the nearest plowed road, surrounded by a forest that was 90% white pine and 10% shadow, all wrapped in a bitter, high-altitude cold that felt less like temperature and more like pressure. He'd meticulously planned for everything inside the perimeter of the cabin walls. It was the 3rd week of December. The snow had started a week into his tenancy, a thick, smothering blanket that transformed the landscape from rugged wilderness to a pristine, terrifyingly quiet void. The nearest human life was 18 miles back down the frozen track. The only sound Elias permitted was the low thrum of the propane generator, which he ran religiously for a few hours in the early evening to charge his minimal electronics and boil water. For the remaining 21 hours, the world was held captive by silence, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow thud of snow sliding and collapsing from the high-pitched roof. He spent his days watching the shadow lines shift across the snow and his nights in the loft, staring out the large triangular window. He had books, a heavy wool blanket, and a single-barrel shotgun resting cold beside the bed, a relic of the cabin owners rather than a tool for Elias himself. He'd been trying to read a forgotten manuscript about a man who retreats to the woods only to find the silence speaks louder than any crowd. A cruel irony now, one that had started to feel like prophecy. The silence broke on the 15th night. He was downstairs, the generator long silent, reading by the dim, yellow glow of the oil lamp. The atmosphere in the room was dense, warm, and static-free, the kind of absolute quiet he had been craving. He was deep into the text, fully absorbed, when the outside world intruded with a tiny, surgical precision. It was a brittle, almost inaudible sound, the snap of a single, frozen pine needle breaking under the weight of something. It wasn't the natural collapse of the snowpack or the wind rustling dry branches. It came from the ground, nearby, too close. Elias froze, the lamp's weak light hardening the contours of his face. He strained his ears, breathing through his mouth to minimize the internal sound. Nothing. Just the slow, internal creak of the wood frame contracting in the profound cold. A deer, he mentally pleaded, forcing his racing pulse to slow. Or a coyote. The snow is so deep and compressed, any movement sounds like a detonation. He waited 5 full minutes, the manuscript pages clutched in his hands, before he allowed himself to exhale and try to recapture the narrative. The attempt was futile. His focus was gone, transferred entirely to the oppressive black mass of the forest pressing against the thin glass of the walls. He didn't sleep that night, which was normal, but he didn't read either. He became a sentinel, standing by the window, the oil lamp casting his shadow monstrous and distorted against the opposite wall, waiting for the moon to set and the world to dissolve into that total, palpable darkness that felt heavy, demanding, and unquestionably watchful. The next morning, the sun was a painful, blinding disk reflecting off the pristine snow. Elias felt the familiar shame of irrational nocturnal panic. He forced a routine. Coffee, wood splitting, a short, perimeter-clearing walk. He pulled on his thickest parka and boots, grabbed the heavy snow shovel, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a solid object. He began tracing the drip line of the roof, moving methodically, careful not to step outside the line of his own large boot prints. The south face was fine, the north face was clean. He walked the full circumference until he reached the back wall, the one facing the thickest grove of tall, unyielding pines. There, about 20 feet from the wall, where the snow was deepest and most undisturbed, was the aberration. It was not a track, which would have implied an animal's gait or a human's boot. It was a shallow, perfectly circular depression, about the size of a dinner plate. It looked as if a large, flat-bottomed bucket had been placed on the deep snow, settled the weight, and then been lifted straight up without any lateral drag mark leading to or away from it. Elias felt the cold tickle of pure, unreasoning adrenaline under his skin. He stopped, holding the shovel like a poor man's spear. He approached the depression, planting his boots carefully outside its pristine circumference. He crouched, his breath erupting in a sudden white cloud. The snow inside the circle was compressed, firm, a dent in the otherwise fluffy surface. He reached a gloved finger and touched the center. It was icy cold and smooth. "Debris," he whispered, his voice sounding brittle in the sharp air. A chunk of ice, or maybe a broken branch, fell. But when he looked up, the nearest branch was 30 feet above, heavy with snow, and motionless. Nothing overhead looked capable of making such a precise, flat imprint. He stood, his gaze sweeping the vertical lines of the pines. The gentle breeze he'd felt minutes ago was gone. The forest was utterly, malevolently still. He quickly shoveled snow into the depression, violently erasing the evidence, and retreated to the safety of the porch. He spent the rest of the day unnerved but forcing productivity. He split wood until his arms ached and baked bread, filling the cabin with a manufactured scent of normalcy. He even put on a cheerful podcast, blasting it through the cabin speakers, trying to drown out the memory of the perfect, inexplicable circle. Paranoia. It's what you came here to cure, he chastised himself. But when the darkness fell, the paranoia didn't recede. It hardened into conviction. He installed the security he should have installed a week ago. He grabbed the heavy-duty floodlight he'd brought, a portable lamp on a stand, and positioned it outside the large front window, aimed to illuminate the clearing. He had to use the generator to power it, violating his fuel conservation plan, but he needed the light. That night, Elias was not reading. He was lying in the loft, the generator humming faintly outside, the shotgun now resting beside the bed, no longer a futile comfort but a heavy, required accessory. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped further, and the house began its nightly song of creaks and metallic groans. He recognized the normal complaints of the old structure. Then, through the noise, a new sound cut through, so precise it felt intentional. It came from the main window downstairs, directly behind the floodlight. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of a fingernail or a piece of metal dragging across the outer pane of glass, or perhaps across the icy crust on the sill. It was rhythmic, and horribly close, clearly distinct from the chaotic rushing of the wind. Elias sat bolt upright, heart hammering against his ribs, recognizing the pattern. A simple, repeating code, a signature. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. The pattern repeated 3 times. It sounded like someone spelling a letter. He swung his legs out of bed, grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight. He descended the wooden stairs, each step a squeak of amplified betrayal in the suffocating silence. He reached the landing, just 10 feet from the window. The sound had stopped. The glass was so thick with frost that the floodlight outside was merely a hazy, greenish corona, distorting the world outside into a swirling canvas of black and gray. He stood there for an eternity, the flashlight beam trembling. He was trying to decide if opening the curtains and looking out would confirm his worst fear or banish a delusion. He opted for stealth, moving slowly to the edge of the window frame, pressing himself against the cold wood. He peered through a small, clear patch near the sill where the heat from the house was winning the battle against the frost. The world outside was a monochrome painting of snow, black trees, and the hazy glare of his own protective light. He saw nothing. Just as he was about to pull back, his eyes caught something on the wooden sill itself, under the frost-laced glass. He angled his flashlight. A thin, perfect line was cut deeply into the weathered wood. It was freshly carved, the wood underneath a bright, sickly yellow in the beam of his light. The line was about 6 inches long, perfectly straight, running parallel to the sill's edge, precisely where the scratching sound had seemed to emanate. Elias felt a wave of icy nausea. Something with a blade or a sharp edge had been right there, inches from his face, leaving a message. He slowly moved the flashlight beam to the glass. By angling the light just so, he could see the faint, swirling patterns scraped into the ice. And there they were. The 3 scratches, followed by the pause, followed by the final scratch. SSPS. He backed away slowly, ascending the stairs backward, his eyes fixed on the evidence of intent, a game of malicious communication. He didn't sleep at all. He sat in the loft, loading the shotgun with buckshot, listening to the generator run pointlessly, waiting for the dawn. The sun, when it finally arrived, was indifferent. Elias knew he had to confirm the mark. He heated water on the wood stove and carried a small bowl downstairs. He poured a careful stream over the windowsill outside, melting the thick frost. The score mark was exactly as he remembered, a deep, 6-inch line. And next to it, partially obscured by a fresh layer of powdered snow that had blown in overnight, was a faint impression in the deep, undisturbed snow beneath the sill. It was a partial footprint. It wasn't the distinct track of a boot, nor the sharp cleft of a hoof. It was bare. It was a large, human-shaped foot, but the impression was too shallow, too wide, and too smoothly compressed to be realistic. It looked more like a depression made by a slab of smooth, frozen meat than a living person's foot. The temperature was still well below freezing. No human could stand out there barefoot and survive the night. It's not real, he thought, desperately. It's an optical illusion, the snow shifting. But the cold, hard certainty in his gut told him otherwise. He quickly grabbed his camera, a sturdy, weatherproof model he used for landscape photography. He installed it on a heavy tripod inside the cabin, aimed squarely at the window and the sill. He set it to time-lapse photography, taking a single frame every 10 minutes, day and night. He also decided to set a trap. He walked a wide, 30-yard perimeter, dragging a large, heavy log behind him to smooth out the snow and erase all previous traces. Then, 20 feet from the cabin wall, directly in line with the marked windowsill, he set a primitive, audible alarm. A long line of loose, dark stones and pebbles, carefully balanced on a thin sheet of salvaged glass from the shed. He covered the whole arrangement with the lightest dusting of fresh snow. Anything heavier than a squirrel stepping there would cause the stones to tumble and the glass to shatter, a loud, unmistakable sound. He retreated inside, feeling marginally, foolishly better for having taken action. He was no longer just the prey of his own mind. He was a participant in the horror, drawing a line in the snow. That evening, he was brittle, wired on coffee and fear. Every natural sound, the crackle of the fire, the minor shift of the cabin, made him flinch violently. He sat downstairs, watching the camera monitor, which showed the world in a greenish, ghostly glow due to the long exposure. Around 1 a.m., the generator was off, the cabin deep in silence. He was sitting in the gloom, sipping cold coffee, his eyes glued to the trap. The glass didn't shatter. The stones didn't fall. But a patch of snow, 3 feet across, just beyond the line of the trap, began to move. It rose slowly, imperceptibly at first, like a silent, growing tumor. It came up about 6 inches, revealing the dark, undisturbed earth below, like a massive, pale eyelid opening onto the world. The movement was too smooth, too mechanical to be any known animal digging. It was a conscious, deliberate movement of the Earth's surface itself. Then, the lifted snow patch simply tilted, like a lid being removed from a box, and gently, impossibly, placed itself back down, exactly where it had been before, erasing the momentary void. It was the quietest, most monumental movement Elias had ever witnessed. It was a clear demonstration that the someone was not only aware of his trap but was actively, intelligently bypassing it. It was a show of contemptuous power. He raced to the camera, his hands shaking, ripped the card out, and loaded the images onto his laptop. He scrolled through the time-lapse frames until he found the sequence. Frame 1. Perfect snow. Frame 2. Snow lifts. Frame 3. A darkness, a void, where the snow was. Frame 4. Snow settles perfectly. He stared at the black void in frame 3. In the center of the void, he saw a fleeting image, a smear of pure white that vanished in the next frame. He zoomed in, pixelating the image until it was meaningless, but before the total distortion, for a split second, he saw it. It looked like a finger. But it was thick, rigid, and jointless, like a porcelain rod, and it was bending the wrong way at the top, a sharp, anatomical betrayal. Elias slammed the laptop shut and sat back, trembling, overwhelmed by a desperate, tearing need for human contact. He had promised himself not to use the two-way radio unless it was a medical emergency, and he could barely articulate this as one. This is not a medical emergency, he thought, this is a cosmological one. He spent the rest of the night barricading the downstairs windows with heavy furniture, pushing armchairs and trunks against the frames, not because he thought the physical defense would stop the thing, but because the ritual of physical labor kept his mind from fracturing entirely. The next day brought a heavy, suffocating fog, turning the forest into a silent, colorless cathedral. Visibility shrank to 20 feet around the cabin, making the perimeter feel simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. Elias was running on pure adrenaline and stale coffee, operating now solely as the defender. He checked his perimeter. The rock and glass trap was still perfectly intact. Nothing had touched it, confirming the entity's ability to move above or beneath the snow without leaving conventional tracks. But when he reached the north side, the side facing the densest woods, he found a new object placed on the snow. Lying precisely in the center of a wide, triangular footprint, a print he had not seen yesterday, was his front porch key. He recognized the distinctive, hand-stitched leather fob. He knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that he had left the key hanging on the peg inside the cabin, next to the door. He never carried it outside. He looked at the key. He looked at the opaque window it had been placed next to. He looked at the impenetrable curtain of fog that marked the tree line. The footprint was the same shallow, wide, unnatural shape he'd seen before. The implication was horrifying. The entity had found a way to enter the cabin without breaking the door or the window, had taken something small and personal, and had returned it, placing it deliberately where he would find it. It wasn't attacking his home. It was invading his mind. It was a game of silent, intellectual cruelty. Why? He whispered into the fog, his voice immediately swallowed. What do you want? He didn't dare touch the key with his hands. He walked back to the woodpile, grabbed the largest, heaviest axe, and walked back. He placed the axe head gently under the leather fob and flipped it into the air, catching it with his free hand. He locked the key back inside, then reinforced the front door frame with a sturdy, diagonal log, wedged from the floor to the opposite wall, a final, desperate act of defiance. The climax of the siege began that night. Elias was in the loft, watching the time-lapse monitor, around 11:30 p.m., when the power died. The generator hadn't sputtered or run out of gas, it had simply ceased. The subsequent silence was total, immediate, and black. He fumbled for his oil lamp and managed to light it, casting the cabin as a tiny, vulnerable beacon. He grabbed the shotgun and crept downstairs, moving toward the lean-to where the generator was housed. He slowly unbolted the door and held the lamp high. The generator was untouched, the fuel full. But the spark plug had been carefully removed and placed on the ground next to the machine. And next to the spark plug, neatly stacked, were 7 small stones. Each stone was perfectly white, almost translucent quartz, and shaped identically, like tiny, elongated eggs. They were utterly alien to the local, dark granite ground. They looked polished, unnaturally smooth, and their placement was deliberate. 7 stones. 7 nights since the first scratch. 7 disturbances. 7 words in a silent sentence. The key was proof of entry. The spark plug was proof of disablement. The stones were proof of counting. He dropped the oil lamp. It sputtered but stayed lit. He backed out of the lean-to, fumbling with the bolt, his eyes wide and tearing. As he closed the door, a low, wet sound came from the dense shadows of the trees. It sounded like a sigh. A profound, heavy, exhalation of something tired, ancient, and immensely patient. Then, the banging began. Not a single, violent crash, but a steady, dull, wet thump against the exterior of the cabin, repeated at precise 3-second intervals. Thump. 3 seconds thump. 3 seconds thump. It was coming from the side wall, near the kitchen. Elias knew the sound. It was the sound of a large, heavy bag of wet sand being swung repeatedly against the thin cedar siding. It was heavy enough to shake the house, but dull enough not to splinter the wood immediately. It was a sound designed to slowly, relentlessly, shatter his resolve. Elias ran up to the loft, his breathing ragged, the rhythm of the thumping driving him mad. He looked down through the triangular window at the silent, dark world. He saw nothing. The fog was still too thick. He grabbed the 2-way radio, frantic, trying every channel. Nothing but static. He was cut off. The floorboards shuddered under his feet. He gripped the shotgun, checked the load, and descended the stairs. He crept toward the kitchen, toward the source of the maddening sound. He knew that if he opened the door, he would see it. A man. An animal. The thing he had only seen in fleeting glimpses. He had to stop the beating. He braced himself and yelled, a sound of pure fear and exhaustion, "Get away. Leave me alone." The banging stopped instantly. The silence returned, vast, absolute, and echoing. Elias waited, his shotgun aimed at the thin wooden door. The air was thick with expectation. Then, a new sound came from the front door, the one reinforced by the log wedge. It was the quietest, most horrifying sound of the night. Click. It was the sound of the door handle turning. The handle, obstructed by the diagonal log, turned gently, slowly, reaching its maximum rotation. The log held firm, but the sound was worse than the banging. The banging was violence. The turning handle was reasoned curiosity, an intelligent, patient attempt to bypass a human defense. It was the sound of something calculating. Elias screamed, a long, ragged sound of pure animal panic, and fired the shotgun blast directly into the wooden door, aiming low, right where the handle was turning. The noise in the small cabin was deafening, the smell of gunpowder sharp and acrid. He collapsed to the floor, panting, the cabin now dead silent once more. He crawled to the door. The cedar was splintered, a large, ragged hole torn near the lock. He could see snow and darkness through the hole. He waited. 30 minutes. An hour. The siege was over. He stayed on the floor until the first weak light of dawn leaked through the upstairs window. He stood, his body stiff. He pushed the log wedge aside, stepped over the splintered wood, and opened the door. The porch was covered in a pristine layer of fresh snow. He looked down. There were no footsteps, no drag marks, no blood. The snow on the porch was smooth, except for the debris scattered by the shotgun blast. He walked around the house to the side wall where the relentless thumping had occurred. The cedar siding was intact. Not a single dent, not a scratch. It looked perfectly normal. Elias stopped breathing. He touched the wall. The wood was cold, dry, and unmarred. He walked to the lean-to. He picked up the dropped oil lamp. The spark plug was still there. The 7 small, white stones were still there, arranged in a neat, insulting line. Elias stared at the stones, then back at the intact wall, then at the empty porch. The realization hit him with a cold horror far greater than any external monster. The siege had been internal. The banging, the handle turning, the sigh, all of it had occurred only inside the cabin, manufactured to convince him of an outside threat. But the hole in the door was real. He had fired the weapon. If the wall was untouched, and the banging was real, where was the sound coming from? He looked up. The cabin was 2 stories. He ran up the stairs to the loft. He stood in the center, and slowly turned. His eyes landed on the floor of the loft, near the wall that overlooked the living room. There, right in the center of the wooden planks, was a section of floor that was not just scratched, but deeply gouged. It was a patch about 3 feet by 3 feet, and the wood was wet, pulpy, and scarred by rhythmic, parallel blows. It was the exact spot on the 2nd floor that was directly above the kitchen wall. Elias bent down and touched the damage. The wood felt spongy and cold. And in the center of the gouged wood, he saw a pattern. It was an impression of a hand. But not a human hand. It was too large, the palm too wide, the fingers thick, rigid, and without joints. And in the very center of the palm impression, there was a hole, a dark, ragged rupture perfectly shaped for the barrel of a single-shot shotgun. Elias recoiled, scrambling backwards until he hit the wall. He had fired the shotgun down, into the floorboards, into the structure of the house, and the thing had been there. The hand had been holding a counterweight, swinging it against the underside of the floor, creating the thumping that reverberated through the thin walls, convincing him it was external. The hand had then reached down, through the space between the floorboards, and grabbed the door handle from underneath, rotating it. The bare foot, the porcelain rod finger, the counting stones, it was all the same entity. It had been inside the house the whole time. He forced himself to stand. He walked to the corner, where the roof pitch met the wall. The cabin was framed by large, square cedar posts. He ran his hand along the post. It was solid, cold wood. He pressed hard. The wood gave way slightly. He pushed again, harder, and a section of the post, about a foot long, pivoted inward like a tiny, secret door he'd never noticed. It revealed a dark, narrow cavity between the interior wall and the exterior siding. It was too small for a man, too tall for a child. And inside, curled up in the darkness, was a thing that defied description. It was thin, like stretched parchment, and gray. Its limbs were long and folded, spider-like, fitting into the tight space with unnatural efficiency. It had no hair, no clothing, and its skin seemed to be the color and texture of wet concrete. It was not moving. It was waiting. It had been living in the walls, moving through the structure like blood in veins. Elias stared into the dark slot. The thing's face was turned toward the wall, but he could see the back of its head. It was perfectly smooth, spherical, and featureless. He was about to slam the panel shut when the head began to turn. Slowly, Deliberately, the sphere rotated, past the point where a human neck would stop, until it was facing him directly. And where a face should have been, there was only the smooth, unbroken, spherical concrete of the skull. The entity had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. But as Elias watched, a new feature began to emerge. On the smooth, gray surface of the sphere, a single, black impression began to form. It looked like a single, perfectly formed, weeping human tear. The tear slowly traveled down the smooth surface of the gray head, leaving a tiny, glistening trail. Then, the tear stopped, and the entity began to vibrate. The vibration was silent, but Elias felt it in his teeth and in the deepest core of his weary brain. A sound, not from a voice box, but from the vibrating air itself, filled the loft. It was the sound of a whisper speaking a single, long drawn-out word, a word that was more of a promise than a threat. Fluent. Elias slammed the panel shut, sealing the entity back into the wall. He stumbled backwards until his spine hit the opposite wall, and he slid down to the floor, leaving the shotgun where it lay. He didn't move for hours. He just stared at the wooden post, now a silent, immovable barrier. When the sun was fully up, casting sharp, indifferent light into the loft, Elias forced himself up. He was calm now. Fear requires uncertainty, and he was certain. He had provided the perfect solitude, the perfect silence, and the perfect structure. He was the host, and the entity was the guest. He spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of absolute, methodical labor. He began cutting long, thick beams. He carried them inside, along with every container of epoxy resin he'd brought for minor repairs. He started at the loft, in the spot where the entity was hidden. He took the thin, pivoting panel, slathered the back with the epoxy, and then nailed it shut, driving 20 penny spikes deep into the surrounding wood until the cedar splintered and wept resin. He then cut a massive beam, wedged it vertically from the floor to the ceiling, directly over the repaired panel, and secured it with more epoxy and thick metal brackets. He moved relentlessly through the entire cabin. Every hole, every gap, every seam, every structural post was filled, sealed, and reinforced. He wedged logs against every supporting beam, turning the interior into a labyrinth of rough-hewn timber. He was not sealing the creature out. He was sealing himself in with it. He understood the message now. The key, the tear, the gentle curiosity. The entity had not come to hurt him, not immediately. It had come to join him. It was a parasite of solitude, the embodiment of total isolation given physical form, and he had provided the means for its permanent residence. He worked for 2 solid days, stopping only to consume cold food and drink water. He secured the floor, the walls, and the ceiling until the cabin was a reinforced wooden shell, a perfect prison. On the 3rd night, when his work was complete, Elias walked to the absolute center of the main room, away from all the newly reinforced walls. He sat down on the floor, wrapped in a thick, dry blanket. He was awake. He was always awake. And from the center of the wooden post right behind him, the one he had sealed shut with 2 days of furious, desperate labor, he heard the sound begin again. It was soft. It was rhythmic. It was the sound of a single pine needle breaking under the weight of something. Snap. Then, a long pause. Snap. The sound was now inside, contained, amplified by the rigid, sealed walls. Elias closed his eyes and finally, after months of torment, he felt the cool, welcoming oblivion of calm wash over him. He was no longer alone in the quiet. He had been found. And that, he realized with a terrifying finality, was why he had truly come to the woods in the first place. Not for silence, but for the one thing that would never leave him again, waiting just behind the wood. Elias smiled, the smile of a man who finally understands his predicament. He was home. Snap. The sound continued, slow and steady, marking the rhythm of his final, shared wakefulness, a heartbeat for two. Snap. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.